Brazil. When you think of it, what comes to mind? Probably vibrant samba rhythms, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Carnival, that explosion of color. Amazing biodiversity, too.
Exactly. But, beyond those really iconic images, there's this legal landscape that's, well, let's just say it can be unexpectedly unique.
That's a good way to put it. Today, we're kind of diving into that fascinating world, the world of Brazilian law, to look at some regulations that might make you sort of scratch your head.
Right. The ones where you think, wait, is that actually a law?
Exactly those.
And it really is. We found some incredible examples, and they're not just quirky, for the sake of it.
No, they offer a real window, actually. A glimpse into the history and the culture, the currents that have shaped this nation.
We're talking about this blend, indigenous traditions, the colonial legacy, and then just the realities of modern life,
All sort of colliding in pretty surprising ways.
especially in a country that big, geographically speaking, and so culturally diverse. So yeah, buckle up for what should be a pretty insightful, maybe even entertaining look at some of Brazil's more unusual legal spots.
Sounds good. So where should we start? Maybe somewhere relatable, like mealtime.
Mealtime works.
Let's talk about some regions in Brazil where, well, you might find certain animal-based foods are surprisingly off the menu on specific days.
Okay, let's unpack that. You mean like in Bahia, for example, there are actual local laws stopping the sale of, say, pork? Or even the seafood on certain days?
Yeah, exactly. Or during certain periods like Lent.
That almost sounds like something from, I don't know, a historical text.
Well, what's really interesting is it's not just some random rule they cooked up.
Right.
It's deeply tied into Brazil's strong Catholic heritage. The whole practice of not eating meat on Fridays, that's been a long tradition there.
Okay, that connects.
So at its core, it's not just about the food itself. It's kind of a living piece of history, showing how religion and culture shape daily life.
That makes sense with the Catholic side. But Brazil also has these incredibly rich Afro-Brazilian traditions, right? They must play a part too.
Oh, definitely. There's this fascinating syncretism going on.
Syncretism, like a blending.
Exactly, a blending of different religious beliefs and practices. So, in places like Salvador and Bahia, these food restrictions can also link up with Afro-Brazilian religious festivals.
For instance.
Well, you might see limits on selling seafood during celebrations for Yemanja, the goddess of the sea. It's a sign of respect for these really important spiritual times.
Wow, so it's this intersection of beliefs just playing out in everyday rules.
Precisely.
And it's not just some like old forgotten law nobody enforces, is it? I think I remember reading something about a British tourist, Recife maybe, in 2019,
Yes.
who got into trouble trying to buy pork when they weren't supposed to.
That's a perfect example of how these local things can have real-world consequences, even for tourists. And yeah, that incident sparked quite a debate online, about whether these laws still make sense today.
So why do they stick around? Is it just tradition?
Well, there's a strong argument that keeping them helps reinforce community ties.
Hmm?
It shows respect for traditions, especially maybe in more rural areas.
Right, connecting to local calendars, shared identity.
Exactly. But then, of course, the flip side is that in a modern, diverse society, they can feel a bit outdated. And the fact that enforcement seems pretty inconsistent.
Yeah, that probably adds to the confusion.
Definitely.
Okay, so from rules about eating to rules about getting around, let's talk about the rodizio system. That's in São Paulo, right?
Yeah.
Where your license plate tells you when you can drive.
Yes, the rodizio. It's a really interesting example of a law created to tackle very modern problems. Huge traffic jams and pretty bad air pollution.
So in São Paulo, based on the last number on your license plate, you just can't drive on certain days during rush hour.
That's the gist of it. It really shows how far a major city might go when facing these big urban challenges, even if it means changing how people fundamentally get around.
It's like a weekday driving lottery then. Plate ends in 1 or 2, no driving Monday mornings or afternoons.
Pretty much. Ends in 3 or 4, maybe that's Tuesday, and so on. They brought this in back in the 90s.
Why then specifically?
Well, São Paulo was dealing with massive growth, huge increase in cars, leading to those legendary traffic jams, engarrafamentos, and real worries about air quality.
You can just picture the gridlock, so this was the official answer.
The main idea was just to cut down the number of cars on the road during peak times. But, like any big intervention,
It probably hasn't been totally smooth sailing.
not entirely. There have been complications.
I can imagine people trying to game the system.
Oh, absolutely. You hear stories. People buying a second car with a different plate ending or even trying to use fake plates.
Which must create headaches for the traffic police.
For sure. And remember that video that went viral? 2023, I think? A driver arguing about a fine, saying the whole system was just too confusing.
Yeah, I think I saw that. You can see how frustrating it would be, especially if you're new there or a tourist.
Definitely. It completely changes how Polistanos, the residents, plan their days, thinking about carpooling, using public transport more on their restricted day.
And for tourists renting a car, sounds like you could easily mess up if you didn't know.
It adds another layer of complexity, absolutely. It highlights that tension, doesn't it, between trying to legislate solutions for big problems and just the practicalities of daily life. Makes you wonder about effectiveness.
Okay, get ready for this next one. This law still makes me kind of blink. We're talking about potentially banning blowing out birthday candles.
Yes, this is definitely one of those that fits squarely in the quirky category we mentioned.
Seriously.
In some towns, especially in the state of Pernambuco, there actually is a law, technically speaking, that forbids this very common birthday thing.
But nobody actually enforces it, right? Please tell me that.
Enforcement is, let's say, exceedingly rare. But just the fact that the law exists on the books is, well, it's fascinating.
Fascinating is one word for it. What on earth is the story behind that?
It seems to come from this old superstition. The idea that blowing out the candles actually scatters your wishes, maybe weakens them, or even brings bad luck.
Really?
Yeah, it seems to draw on a mix of indigenous beliefs and Afro-Brazilian folklore.
So it's tied deep into cultural beliefs then, not just random.
Exactly.
Okay.
The story goes, sometime mid-20th century, one small town actually wrote this into law after some bad things happened that people blamed on birthday parties where candles were blown out.
No way.
Apparently, local spiritual advisors were involved, suggesting the ban was like spiritual protection. It really shows how powerful folklore can still be.
Wow. You hear about laws for everything, but birthday candles.
Yeah?
That's specific. And didn't something happen recently that brought this up again?
Yeah, in 2018, remember that story? Someone at a party in Recife was jokingly reported for blowing out the candle.
Oh, yeah.
Nothing actually happened, no fine or anything, but it got people's attention. Led to a bunch of memes online about this weird law.
It really highlights that connection Brazil has with superstition, spirituality, even in surprising ways. You have these big parties, fancy cakes, candles. But this one tiny action is potentially, technically, against the rule.
It's a really interesting contrast, isn't it? Shows the kind of unexpected cultural details you can find across Brazil.
Okay, so moving from possibly banned birthday stuff to possibly banned beach stuff, let's talk about swimwear. There are laws in some cities banning certain kinds of revealing swimsuits.
Yes, this one is a bit more sensitive. It touches on personal freedom versus what's seen as acceptable in public. Cities like Fortaleza, Florianopolis, they do have local rules against specific types of very revealing swimwear.
With potential fines for indecent attire.
Correct.
That seems kind of surprising. Given Brazil's famous beach culture and, let's be honest, sometimes very minimal swimwear is pretty normal there. What's the history?
Well, these laws started popping up more around the 1980s. That was during Brazil's return to democracy. And you had some more conservative local governments, especially in the South and Northeast, trying to sort of regulate public spaces as cities grew and tourism increased.
So trying to set standards.
Kind of. There was a specific rule in Florianopolis back in '85 banning excessively revealing swimsuits. Though what excessively revealing actually means, well, that was always a bit vague.
Open to interpretation?
Exactly. It really gets into that ongoing push and pull in Brazil between modernity and tradition.
So it was partly about changing social norms, maybe different expectations from locals versus tourists?
That's definitely part of it. And specific incidents have really pushed this issue forward, like that French tourist in Fortaleza 2021.
Right, who got fined for wearing a thong bikini.
Yes, that really set off a big debate about individual liberty versus community standards, public decency, you know?
Yeah, you can see the arguments on both sides there. Freedom of choice, especially at the beach, versus communities wanting certain standards in public.
Precisely. And it brings up wider questions, too, often about gender, because these rules tend to impact women more often.
That's a fair point.
It's also interesting how inconsistently they seem to be enforced.
Yeah.
You might see the exact same kind of swimwear during Carnival or on Copacabana Beach with no problem at all.
Right. So it really shows this ongoing negotiation in Brazilian society, doesn't it? About where you draw the line between expressing yourself and public norms. and who decides what's okay.
Exactly. It reflects a society with lots of different views trying to figure out these changing social rules.
Brazil's legal world sounds just packed with these kinds of surprises. Are there maybe a couple of other quick examples of these unusual laws, just to illustrate the point further?
Oh, sure. Think about Rio de Janeiro taking selfies with street performers.
Okay.
You technically need their permission, apparently, to protect their income.
Mm.
There was a German tourist back in 2022 who reportedly got fined for not asking.
Huh. Okay, what else?
Then you've got pretty strict rules about importing certain foods. Someone in Sao Paulo actually got detained a few years back over some novelty candy they brought from Japan.
Seriously? For candy?
Seems so. And get this. Some cities still have laws needing permits for public dancing.
Dancing permits.
Yeah, apparently leftovers from the dictatorship era. Led to a kind of funny situation in Brasilia. In 2019, some tourists got questioned just for dancing in a public square.
Wow. Okay, it really sounds like you need to keep your eyes open and be aware of local ways of doing things.
Oh, absolutely.
So if you're listening and thinking about a trip to Brazil, what's the main takeaway? How do you navigate this?
Well, as a potential visitor, it's probably smart to do a little bit of homework on local rules, especially if you're going to major cities.
Where would you find this info?
Guidebooks often mention common restrictions, like maybe rules about what's okay to wear on certain beaches or not feeding stray animals in cities, things like that.
And it sounds like the big thing is that rules can be really different from one place to another.
Exactly that. The inconsistency in enforcement is key. Remember that story from 2023? British couple fined in Natal.
Happened.
They were just sitting on the beach after dark. Apparently, there was a local curfew they had no idea about.
Oh, wow.
It just underlines how important it is to be, culturally sensitive and just ready for things you might not expect.
So it all comes back to why these sometimes really odd laws are even there. What do they actually tell us about Brazilian culture and values?
Well, these laws, strange as they might seem sometimes, they do give us a really interesting look into Brazilian values.
Like what?
Things like the importance of tradition, strong sense of community, even the influence of spirituality, all coexisting in a country that's also changing really fast, modernizing.
Okay, so the food rules connect back to respecting heritage. The radicchio tackles modern city problems. The swimsuit stuff is about freedom versus community norms.
Right. And the birthday candle ban. A fascinating peek into how much belief and superstition can still matter.
Yeah, that one's still wild to me.
And we also need to remember Brazil's government structure. It's quite decentralized.
Meaning states and cities have a lot of power.
A good amount of autonomy, yeah, to
Yeah.
make their own laws. So that naturally creates this diverse, sometimes surprising mix of regulations across the country.
Which makes you wonder, is Brazil totally unique in this? Or do other countries have their own weird laws?
Oh, Brazil's collection is definitely notable, but yeah, lots of countries have their own unusual laws based on their history and culture.
Aye.
Well, Japan has rules about dancing late at night in some places. Singapore's famous ban on chewing gum.
Right, I've heard of that one.
So other places have them. But what maybe makes Brazil stand out is just the sheer variety and how often the laws mix really old traditions with responses to very current issues.
So, bringing our deep dive to an end here, it seems pretty clear that Brazil's legal system is just as lively and complex as its culture. From things that sound almost unbelievable, like the candle thing, to stuff that really impacts daily life, like the driving restrictions, these laws definitely add a layer of unpredictability.
They really do. And in the end, these unique rules give us this fascinating view into all the different forces, historical, social, spiritual, that have shaped Brazil into the really captivating, complex country it is today.
So, for you listening right now, which of these laws was the biggest surprise? What does it make you wonder about Brazilian culture? It definitely feels like in Brazil, that line between just the ordinary and the truly extraordinary is, well, it's wonderfully blurry, isn't it?
It really is. Always something more to explore.